This did not begin yesterday. History is familiar with this moment, the moment when great powers, having exhausted the language of diplomacy, begin to speak in the grammar of force. We have seen it before many times across centuries. What distinguishes this particular juncture is not that war is coming. What distinguishes it is that war has already begun. Only we do not yet recognize it as such because we are still waiting for the sound of missiles. The assumption that war announces itself through explosions is itself a strategic error. The machinery of great power conflict operates on longer timescales than our media cycles permit us to comprehend. By the time the first warhead falls, the actual war, the war of competing logic, incompatible interests, and irreconcilable visions of order, has already been decided. We must understand the underlying conditions before we can understand the actions they produce. The post-Cold War arrangement, the system by which the West, and particularly the United States, maintained global primacy through military superiority, economic integration, and institutional dominance, was always temporary. Not because it was unjust or because it failed morally. Temporary because all hegemonic orders eventually encounter the same historical obstacle: the rise of competitors who reject the rules written by the hegemon. Russia did not invent this pattern. It merely found itself on the losing side of one. For 30 years, Moscow watched as NATO expanded eastward, as American military bases encircled its borders, as the economic architecture of the world was designed without Russian consent or participation. These were not provocations in the emotional sense. They were simply the logical consequences of American power and Russian weakness. But weakness is not permanent. Weakness is a condition that invites correction, and that correction, when it comes, does not announce itself politely. It announces itself through action. The West, meanwhile, operated from a set of assumptions that have proven to be not merely wrong, but strategically disastrous. The assumption that democracy would inevitably spread. The assumption that economic interdependence would make conflict unthinkable. The assumption that the rules-based international order would persist simply because the West preferred it. These were not merely policy failures. They were failures of imagination, an inability to conceive that others might not want what we were offering. We must understand that Russia's actions in Ukraine, its military modernization, its diplomatic realignments with China and others, these are not aberrations. They are rational responses to rational constraints. Moscow faces a choice. It can accept permanent subordination to Western dominance, or it can act to prevent that dominance from closing off its sphere of influence permanently. Vladimir Putin, whatever one thinks of him, is not irrational. He is operating according to a clear strategic logic. Ukraine represents the final threshold. Once it is absorbed into NATO, once American missiles are stationed on Russia's doorstep, once the encirclement is complete, Russian strategic options narrow to near zero. This is not opinion. This is geometry. The West, meanwhile, has committed itself to a logic of its own that Ukrainian sovereignty is non-negotiable, that NATO expansion cannot be halted by Russian objection, that the liberal democratic order must expand or die. These are not unreasonable positions, but they are positions that assume the West retains the power to enforce them indefinitely. They assume American military superiority is permanent. They assume economic leverage will always work. They assume time is on our side. History suggests these assumptions are unwise. Consider the pattern. Before the Peloponnesian War, Athens and Sparta did not declare war because they disagreed about democracy. They went to war because their respective systems of power, their alliances, their interests, their visions of regional order became incompatible. Neither could tolerate the other's dominance. Both believed they could prevail. War was the logical conclusion. Before World War I, Europe did not stumble into catastrophe because of an assassin's bullet. The bullet was simply the mechanism by which underlying strategic tensions, imperial rivalries, arms races, alliance commitments, and incompatible visions of European order finally broke through the surface. The war had already been decided by the logic of the system. The assassination merely revealed it. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union never fought directly, yet they fought constantly in Korea, in Vietnam, and Afghanistan through proxies and client states and nuclear brinkmanship. They understood implicitly that direct confrontation meant mutual annihilation, so they fought in every way except the most direct. This was not peace. This was war conducted according to different rules. What we are witnessing now follows the same pattern. The confrontation in Ukraine is not an isolated regional conflict. It is the visible manifestation of a deeper strategic competition between two incompatible systems, one that seeks to maintain Western-led global dominance, the other that seeks to restore Russian regional primacy and prevent American encirclement. Here is what distinguishes great power conflicts from ordinary wars. They are not decided in months. They are decided by whoever can sustain the sacrifice longer. They are decided by demographics, by industrial capacity, by the willingness of populations to bear cost. They are decided ultimately by time. The West assumes that Ukrainian resistance is admirable and that Russian resources will eventually exhaust themselves. This may be true, but this assumption requires that the West maintain its commitment indefinitely, that NATO stay unified, that American voters continue to support aid to Ukraine, that Europe does not fracture under economic pressure. These are not certain things. Russia, meanwhile, assumes that time is its ally, that Western attention spans are short, that alliances are fragile, that economic pain will eventually break Western resolve. This too may be true, but it requires that Russia can sustain casualties, that its economy can function under sanctions, that it can avoid direct confrontation with NATO that would trigger nuclear escalation. Both sides are betting on endurance. Both sides believe they can outlast the other. History suggests that usually one of them is wrong. Wars do not typically begin when one side decides to surrender. They begin when both sides believe they can win. They escalate when both sides believe they have no choice. They spiral outward when the logic of the initial conflict pulls in other actors, creates new pressures, generates new imperatives. Consider the trajectory. First, there is the proxy conflict, Ukraine as the proving ground. Then, as costs mount and stakes rise, there is the question of NATO involvement. At what point does providing weapons become participation? At what point does participation become direct confrontation? These are not clear lines. They are gradual transitions that can be rationalized at each step. Once NATO forces are directly engaged, the logic changes fundamentally. It is no longer Ukraine's war. It becomes the West's war. And Russia's response must be calculated to impose enough cost to force the West to recalculate its interests. This is where the machinery of escalation begins to operate without restraint. This is not prediction. This is simply how such situations historically evolve. The greatest danger in such confrontations is not malice. It is miscalculation. It is the tendency of each side to overestimate its own strength and underestimate its opponent's resolve. It is the tendency to assume that the other side will back down if we simply push hard enough. The United States entered Vietnam believing that American military superiority was overwhelming, that the North would eventually capitulate, that the war would be won in months. This was not malice. It was miscalculation born of overconfidence. The cost was catastrophic. Russia in Ukraine may be making similar miscalculations, assuming that the West will fracture, that Ukraine will capitulate, that American resolve is ephemeral, or the West may be miscalculating, assuming that sanctions will work faster than they do, that Russian resolve will crack, that nuclear weapons are unusable and therefore irrelevant to the conflict. When both sides miscalculate simultaneously, the results are usually terrible. The Thucydides trap is not a prediction, it is a pattern. When a rising power challenges an established hegemon, conflict becomes more likely. Not certain, but more likely. And the conflict, when it comes, is usually larger and more destructive than anyone anticipated because the stakes are not merely regional. They are systemic. They determine the structure of the international order itself. The Cold War taught us that such confrontations can be managed without direct great power war, but only through clear communication, mutual understanding of red lines, and the sobering recognition that the alternative is mutual annihilation. We seem to be losing that understanding. What we are losing is the shared grammar of restraint that kept the Cold War cold. We are losing it because both sides increasingly believe that the other is irrational, that negotiation is futile, that victory is possible. When both sides believe this, the logic of conflict accelerates. History suggests the cost of such conflicts comes later, not immediately. It comes in ways that were not anticipated, that ripple outward in unexpected directions. Economic systems that seemed robust collapse under strain. Alliances that seemed permanent fracture under pressure. Populations that seem pacifist mobilize for war when their survival seems at stake. The assumption that nuclear weapons make great power war impossible has proven to be wishful thinking. Nuclear weapons do not prevent war. They merely raise the cost and narrow the margin for error. They make the stakes higher, not lower. They make rational actors more cautious, not more confident. But rational actors can still find themselves in irrational situations where the logic of the conflict itself becomes detached from any rational calculation of interest. This is what happened in 1941. This is what happened in 1941. This is the danger we face now. The missiles have not yet fallen. The warheads have not yet detonated. But the war has already begun in the logic of systems that are incompatible, in the decisions of leaders who see no alternative, in the slow accumulation of incidents that cannot be undone. By the time we recognize it as war, it will be too late to prevent it. This is not unprecedented. That is what makes it dangerous. History has already written this chapter before. We simply refused to read it carefully enough while we still had time. The next great power conflict will not begin with a dramatic declaration or a shocking first strike. It will begin, as all such conflicts begin, with the logic of necessity overtaking the hope of restraint. And by the time that moment arrives, the only choices remaining will be how to fight, not whether to fight at all. This is the moment we are in, not the moment before the storm. The moment when the storm is already here, only we have not yet admitted it to ourselves.